Hi, Mike Beckett here from The Dead Prophet. We hope you enjoyed part one of Making a Leader Shift, Becoming a Holistic Leader with John Szymanski. And now we are going to go ahead and watch part two.
I almost think it's kind of an oxymoron where we say, okay, I'm going to fulfill my fulfill my dream or fulfill my goals business wise in ministry because, like you said, the majority of our churches are under 100. It's the ones that are over are far and few between, and the ones that are over, might have obviously not all of them, but could have from just the examples that you have seen in your ministry with where you're at now, that we've focused on the ladder of success and not the faithfulness of God and the faithfulness to His calling in our lives. And I think a lot of times we see pastors today who have, I want to exchange the calling for a career. Like ministry becomes the career and not the calling, and that right there is a dynamic shift that has totally, and I think it's just fallen into the hands of the enemy, just being able to incorporate and empower people to compare themselves to the world. And they're looking at these other churches that might have 10,000 people, and when you get down to their doctrinal teaching and you sit back and you think, okay, it's not scriptural, or you look at they're making 7 8 figures and flying in their jets and on television, and yet you don't see them out in the streets feeding the poor without their posse around them. You don't see them just, I'm going to go out today and I'm just going to preach on the street corner. I'm going to go out and I'm going to just sit in the park and pray about who the Lord wants me to minister to today. We don't see the basic kind of what the disciples did, and utilizing all of that we have within Scripture to do what we need to do, instead of utilizing all that we have within our material resources to do what we need to do as far as leadership. So you talked about success. The other thing that you had kind of mentioned with this is Apostle Paul measures his success in leadership really by one thing. It wasn't how big his church was. It wasn't how many churches he planted. It wasn't how many people were giving to the coffers, but it really was faithfulness. And you had mentioned 2 Timothy 4:7. I've fought the good fight, I've finished the race, I've kept the faith and remained faithful. And really, that is the true measure, or should be the true measure of success for those in Christian leadership and ministry, especially.
Again, that's part of the paradigm shift that I believe has to take place, is that we have to redefine success.
Mhm.
We in America, we define success differently than the people that I have met and I know that live in other parts of the world, non-Western pastors and leaders. Again, a lot of my worldview and a lot of my how I see things, it has been shaped in part by me rubbing shoulders with many uh, non-Western pastors and leaders. They would describe America as like a Disneyland, and how we do what we do, and how we do church here is so different than the way they do church. And so there's much of how I see things that has been shaped by them, where their focus is not on the temporal, but it's on the eternal.
Mhm.
And their goal is to be faithful from in this life until God calls them home. That's their goal. I want to be faithful. Where we have more of a career mentality, in America. But again, I'm saying all of this because I've been caught in this. This was, if I do this, if I do that, if I move here, I move there. You can somehow um, make a name for yourself, and you can become known. Where that is really not the case with the pastors and the leaders that I have rubbed shoulders with, in Central Asia and in the Middle East. Um, Again, their focus is on the eternal, and their goal during this life on earth is to be faithful and to pastor the people that God has entrusted into them. Last year, for example, we were in the UK. We were with a husband and wife that we met in '92 when we went to the UK. It's an Iranian couple, speak 5 languages. They pastor two Iranian churches, very, very small Iranian churches. 90% of the people that attend the church have fled Iran. And they're providing all kinds of care to take care of the physical and the financial needs. Their focus is on faithfulness. When Lynn and I would talk with them, they talk about these are the people that God has entrusted. They wouldn't say it in these terms, but this is in essence what they were saying. These are the people that God has entrusted to us, and we're going to do everything within our power to help them to become good, mature followers of Christ. And we have a responsibility to see that their health and their well-being is taken care of. That's first and foremost. Well, that challenges me as an American pastor, because if I'm in a larger environment, and I've got multiple staff, I'm going to, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask, a particular staff person or staff individuals in that to make sure that they have a ministry that's focused on that. And I'm going to focus on growing the church. Again, growing the church is not synonymous with reaching people for Christ. Some people would take me to task on it, and they said it's just a matter of semantics. I've been there, done that. Mm-hmm. Somehow I convinced myself that if I grow the church, I'm reaching people for Christ and I'm making disciples. And what I had to come to terms with, that I was more interested in growing a bigger church for my own sake than actually reaching people for Christ and making them strong followers of Christ. Two different strategies and two different goals.
Yeah, it seems. Would you say what in talking with some of those pastors from non-Western cultures, obviously equipping, mobilizing faithfulness, what would be some indicators that they might say they're really concerned about the American church and the salvation, if you will? So, but they're really concerned about the American church. What are some things that you may have heard over the years that they may have said, this is, I'm not going to say it's not scriptural, but this is a big flag that we should be concerned about?
I remember I made a trip into China and many, many decades ago. And I remember sitting across the table from a house church pastor. He was fairly well known. And so there was a measure of protection, that he had, just because of the contact that he had with Americans. And I remember sitting across the table with him, and we were in his house church, and he showed me the little room off to the side where he lived. It was a bed and just a handful of books. And he told me a story, that he had been in prison for 20 years. And I think it was over two different times. But it was during the second imprisonment, when he was released, he found out that his wife had passed away, 2 years previously, but that information was not communicated to him. And I asked him what do you want? What do you people, or what are you concerned about? When you think about the American church? And he said, in essence, what he said was that we are praying that the American church experience persecution. Well, in my mind, I'm saying, well, that's a horrible prayer to pray. He went on to say that the American church needs to be purified of all of the things that are not essential, to being followers of Christ and growing the kingdom. And again, I'm talking, with a house church pastor that is known by many, American and Western leaders. And he tells me that, and it just hit me very hard. And I wonder, so is there some type of a purification that we've got to go through that would be equivalent of a paradigm shift that would move us, from the CEO type of leadership back to the pastoral leadership, where we're leading like a shepherd, not necessarily leading like a business leader, where our focus is primarily on the health and the well-being of the people that God has entrusted to us, where our strategy is determined by reaching people from Christ and not just growing a church. I think it was Francis Chan that said that it's really, really easy to grow a church. All you have to have is a good band, from some fog, an eloquent preacher, and you're going to grow a church. So far to say that you don't even really need the Holy Spirit. He doesn't even have to be there. He doesn't have to be present, because we've got the formulas. We've got the technology. We have all of the tools to grow churches. But the question is, are we effective in reaching people for Christ? And if in fact we were to experience any significant amount of pushback or persecution, do we have people that are strong enough to withstand that type of pressure, where they would stand the test of time and say, my allegiance and my loyalty is to Christ?
Yeah.
Have we developed those types of disciples? So when I think of Jesus, and I think of the 12 disciples, that he developed, they stood the test of time. When things were at its worst for them personally, they chose to follow Christ. Are we making disciples where their default is to trust Christ and to go take go to the distance with him, regardless of cost that has to be paid? I'm saying I've never thought about that question, but as I look back over the time that I have spent as a pastor, I can honestly say that was not the driving force within me. Yeah. I was in growing the church, and but again, being outside of it, I'm saying this is part of the problem. We've got a leadership problem. We have a leadership crisis. There's that idolatry, of bigness that we're pursuing. Yeah. When I read that article, I had to admit, I said that I bought into it. I did, and as a result of that, and as well as other things, we got a mental health crisis with pastors,
and they have no place to go because of that vulnerability component, which is really sad. And when you get into a church, even if you are a church of 100 or less, and you're in a community, well, they see you walking into, Dr. Johnson's counseling office, they're going to think, well, I saw him walking into the counseling office. What's he, so they're walking into Counselor Johnson's office, and people are just like, something must be wrong with him. We need to investigate. And it could be something simple where he just feels he needs to go and just talk about people he talked with that week to kind of dump. I mean, my wife being in counseling, she says every counselor should have a counselor that they go to dump the junk they have to get dumped on, so that they don't become part of this cyclical, falling into depression, falling into anxiety. I mean, I deal with anxiety and depression. I have bipolar tendencies, but I'm to the point now where I'll tell you about it. But 10 years ago, I'm not gonna let people know that I'm depressed. I remember I was having a conversation. I have a 16-year-old now. Andy is 16 years old, and I'm sure you've experienced it. When you have a boy, there's times where they know everything, and him and I are at the stage of life where we're like oil and water, and we have a lot more oil and water days than we do. And I was talking with our pastor about it, and I said, it's actually gotten better. We started being worship director. I said, Andy and I have actually connected really well doing this worship stuff because he does all the tech there. And I said, it's really neat. But he said to me, I said, I suffer from anxiety, I suffer from depression, and I have bipolar tendencies. And he said, I would never have known because you mask it well. And I think when he said that, I'm thinking to myself, maybe that's the problem, is that I have masked it too well. When people say, how you doing? I mean, I'm not unloading all of my laundry, but I'm doing good. I'm having a good day. But a good day to me might not be a great day to somebody else. And but there's that kind of part of me that's like, I don't want to tell people that I struggle with this because they might think differently of me. But I think in the reality, there are more people in our churches that suffer from the same things these leaders on those statistics suffer from, that I think somewhere along the line, we've got to be teaching within our Bible colleges that it is okay to be human within reason. It doesn't mean it's a stamp to continue to sin, but we need to be human. and allow ourselves some vulnerability, because in that vulnerability, I mean, look at Jesus. He was vulnerable to his 12 disciples. In that vulnerability, there's an emotional connection that will connect, that I think may be needed to maybe reverse some of this uh, success is better, success is the way to go, and really go back to maybe those foundational pastoral shepherding components that you have been talking about.
Well, transparency, vulnerability, they build credibility and they build trust. Credibility and trust are key components that a pastor and a ministry leader needs to have. And they need to have that with the team and with the people that he or she is leading. And we see that again. You cited Jesus. He was tired, and he told them. Now they knew that he was the Son of God, but yet he's tired. He was very transparent, very vulnerable with them. I look at the life of the Apostle Paul. Paul was very, very open, very transparent with his life. And so when I read about him, what I see is that there's a lot of merit to being very, very transparent and very vulnerable with some of the things that that you struggle with. He said, he had a thorn in the flesh, and of course God used that to keep him humble. But Paul was someone who said, "It's in my weakness God makes me strong," and he was very open with his weaknesses. I think we've entered into that place in American culture where we feel more comfortable being transparent and being more vulnerable. But back to something you said regarding Shauna, I personally believe now that every pastor needs another pastor who has been there and done that. So he or she could call up this person at any time and say, "This is what I'm thinking. This is what I'm going through," and talk with them about that. So Jesus sent out, everybody in pairs. When I look at the Church of Antioch, Paul and Silas, they were sent out, together. They were sent out in pairs. There are strength when you have somebody that you can call and you can talk to. Having a pastor who's been there and done that is different than having a counselor and a therapist. And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to have one to the exclusion of the other. You have a therapist, they're trained in dealing with some of the mental health issues that a pastor or a ministry leader is dealing with. But just to have another pastor and someone who's seasoned, who's again been there, done that, you can call them up and I said, "This is what I'm facing. This is what I'm experiencing." And for them to be able to talk with you, and I do this all the time. I'm on the phone with people, and let's say I'm on the phone an hour with them, and 50 minutes is just them talking. And my goal is just to listen. I had, I spoke with a pastor. It was early on this week. We were on the phone for about an hour and 10 minutes. He was talking about very intimate issues. I probably spoke 10 minutes of the hour and 10 minutes, but he had the 60 minutes where he talked. At the end of the conversation, he said to me, "I just want to thank you for listening to me because you're the first person that I think has actually heard me." That's all we needed. Just needs to be heard by someone who's been there, who's done that, who says, "I'm going to walk through this with you."
It's interesting. Even I work in education. Like I said, I do a whole bunch of things, but one of the things that in communicating with students, we've had trainings on, and that is to, silence is good. Silence is good. You don't feel like you have to have an answer for everything somebody is sharing with you. And that's difficult for me, because as soon as somebody says something, especially within, my wife or son, I'm like, I'm already there. I'm like a mile down the road, and they're like, "Can I finish what I'm saying?" But it seems like, that's what people need. They need to be able to have that spot where they can just come and talk and look, this is what's happening in my life, and have that other person on the other end just listening and, speaking as need be.
And again, you're not going to find that level of openness when a small group of pastors get together. That's not going to be the case. So again, I'm not going to open up about, I've been battling an addiction with porn, or I'm over medicating myself, or I've started drinking to numb myself to some of the pain. That is not going to come out, within the context of a small group of people. That will, when you're talking one-on-one with someone that you build a relationship with, that you trust, and then they're going to take you to the next level and say, can I just tell you some of the things, some of my coping mechanisms? And a lot of times, as I get into conversations with pastors and ministry leaders, at some point in time, I ask them the question: tell me, how are you coping with all of this? And for the most part, if I've got a relationship with them that's been that has been cultivated over the course of time, they're going to say these are the things that are going on in my life.
And it can be scary to say it to just anybody else, depending on where you're at in that tier of ladder of ministry. There's a quote you put in here, and again, going back to that successful, kind of defining success from Mother Teresa. And she said, I was never called to be successful. I was just called to be faithful. And in my striving to be faithful, my life will be fruitful. And because it's fruitful, you could say I am successful. I mean, when you think about it, when she died, she wasn't being buried in a golden casket. It was just a wooden box that they carried her with an open lid to put her in the ground. And when we get to the end of our lives, as leaders and in church leadership and as pastors or ministry leaders, that's what it's about.
Yeah,
It's not about, did I have a multi-million-dollar ministry that sent materials all over the world and I was on television every week. It's, was I faithful? Because Christ tells us to be faithful in the small things, and He'll be faithful in the big. And that's just amazing. Any other thoughts on that first myth? Kind of before we jump into the second one: bigger, better, success are synonymous, and becoming a great leader is key to success. Any other thoughts you'd like to mention?
If we're faithful in the small, God will entrust more to us. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to move from one church that's smaller to a larger church. But again, that's the way. That's how we interpret it. Let me go back to this couple that that are in England. So both of them, they're pastoring two Iranian churches. They left Iran, when the Ayatollah came into power. They came to the UK as refugees, and eventually they ended up taking on these two churches, and they're serving the people well. Now, in light of the scripture that you said, that if we're faithful in the small, God will give us more. Well, again, it doesn't necessarily have to be equated with, okay, I've got a small church, so that gives me the freedom and the leeway to look for something larger because I have been faithful here. That may not be the case, but in their case, what happened is God opened up a door for them, where they have been doing weekly broadcasts in Farsi that are being broadcast, throughout the UK, throughout Europe, and throughout the Middle East, where they're reaching thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Farsi speakers. But they sit in the UK pastoring two small churches where 90% of the people have fled Iran, and they're not really sure what tomorrow is going to bring. That's faithfulness.
Yeah, that's totally taking what we have here in the United States and flipping it upside down.
And so it challenges me as a person. It's like, okay, so then what is, what drives you? Is it the need and the desire to be successful? If that's the case, then the way you can become successful is that you have a bigger church,
Mhm.
or you have a ministry.
Mhm.
You have written books, and you're on the circuit, and your name is plastered everywhere. Is that the driving factor? Is that the primary motivation within the heart of the leader? Or is the primary motivation is that I'm going to be faithful with what it is that God has given me
Mhm.
to
Yeah.
not be the more that someone else has, but can I be content with what it is that He's entrusted me to do? And if this is all that He asked me to do on this side, of life, then am I content with that? Those are really, really penetrating questions that we have to ask ourselves. Looking back on it, I'm saying if I was to grade myself, it would be below a C, because the driving motivation, because I was caught in this culture where we want to be successful. We just want to be successful. And the way we become successful is that we have a growth plan that is going to work just like a business plan. We have a growth plan that's going to work, and we're going to move from here to there to the next. But in the end, at the very end, the question that I have to ask myself, and every pastor has to ask himself or herself, am I being faithful to what it is that he's called me to do? And if the growth plan doesn't work, am I being faithful to make disciples of the people that God has entrusted to me? And am I reaching my community for Christ, where we are building a kingdom-oriented community there that's going to bring transformational change to the lives of people within the community?
And that's what it's all about. It's interesting. Not to toot a horn because I don't want to fall into this thing, but I just wrote a book, and it talks about Christianity at Crossroads. I analyzed the 7 churches in Revelation, and the historical content, comparing it to our American culture. But the very last chapter, I was like, how do I end this book? What do I do? So I actually just got vulnerable and said, these are the things I struggle with. Yep. This is where I'm at in my walk with Jesus Christ, and this is where I need to keep going. And that if I miss it or I throw the towel in on any one of these areas, it's going to be a disaster. And I'm hoping when it gets released that is the biggest part that they get out of that is not all the history and all, but that, look, here is somebody who is just a common person who walks their life with Jesus Christ and has hurdles every day, but is going to choose to try to change themselves into the image of Christ by changing, whatever the habits may be, maybe the quick judgment on people, when they come in or somebody annoys you and you just kind of, it's so funny. We were having a conversation yesterday at church. We live in a gated community out here, and the church gives a lunch for all of the people who work, like the maintenance and stuff. We were sitting down, and my wife was sharing with our new associate pastor that my son had a very bad day at work the other week. And he said to her on the way back, well, I was just about ready to tell Jesus to take a walk so I could tell them what I really thought. And I'm sitting there thinking, we know where he got that from. Me. Because there's times where I get so frustrated. It's like, well, if Jesus just takes a walk down the street, I can just let loose. And then when he comes back, I can kind of make it all cool and chill. But that's not how being a disciple of Jesus Christ is. And but I got a kick out of it because I realized, even in my own walk with Christ, there are some flaws, and flaws enough that my kid picked up on it. And is that really what I want my son to understand that we can do when we get frustrated and mad? Again, coming back to that whole change of thought, even within your own personal walk, so that you don't become like the status quo here in America.
Jesus made a penetrating question. It was really a rhetorical question when he asked, what does it profit a man if he gain the whole world and lose his own soul? So let's apply that to ministry. What does it profit a pastor or a ministry leader if he gained ministry success by how the culture deems success, and he lose his or her own soul? We deal with people, pastors and ministry leaders, who are in the process of losing their soul or have lost their soul. So when you've got 42 or even 35% of pastors on the brink of throwing in the towel, you have to ask, are you in a brownout? Are you in a burnout? But when you move from the brownout to the burnout, then you end up dropping out. So you've got 42% or less that are actually thinking about throwing in the towel. When you start to talk with them, you realize that they're losing their soul for the sake of ministry. And Jesus said, so what does it profit you? Does it profit you if you try to do all the right things by the culture to grow a church or grow a ministry, because in your mind you think that this is really going to make a difference. And so you keep pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing. You don't have any friends, you don't have any confidants, you don't have anyone that you can talk to, and maybe challenge some of the thoughts, some of the paradigms that you're operating from.
Yeah.
And what happens is we push ourselves to the point where we end up losing our own soul. I say that because that happened to me, and that's what we call brownout. I mean, that's when we burning out.
Yeah.
We've lost our soul.
Yeah.
Jesus picks up on that. What does it profit a man if he pursues the path of success, but he loses his own soul in the process? At Standing Stone, we're working backwards. So I have a leader that I've been working with over the past year, who's making a transition to a year of rest and restoration, and that it's been a horrible situation. But at one point in time, when we shifted from talking about what he needs to do or what he should not do to keep the church going, to preserving his soul, because I knew where this thing was moving. I knew that the church would eventually implode. And then he's going to look at all of the pieces and wonder, what did I do right? What did I do wrong? What am I responsible for? He starts to feel guilty, regretful, and so on and so forth. And so my focus shifted to what I want to do is I want to help you get into a healthy place, look at things through a healthy paradigm, so that when everything does implode, you don't basically say, I'm out of it. I don't want to do ministry anymore. So you take a year of rest and restoration, and you get back into the ministry ring.
Into the calling versus the career.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And a calling is something that transcends, as I said to him, calling transcends assignments. We have multiple assignments, but the calling is there. I said, so this assignment looked like it failed. But what we can't afford to allow happen to you is that you lose your soul in the process, because if you lose your soul in the process, there will be no other assignments for you to assume. And so when we talk about 33 or 35% or 42% of pastors who are considering throwing in the towel, if they throw in the towel and because they have lost their soul, for the cause of ministry, if they don't regain that, then they're never going to get back in the game. They're never going to come back into and assume some kind of ministry assignment. We've lost them completely, and we really can't afford to do that. You can't afford to see so many churches closing and so few churches being started and opening, and then you're having this kind of an erosion of the people that God's called to actually lead churches and lead kingdom initiatives within America.
And when you look at the status of where we're heading, it's like you've said, it's very dangerous, and those numbers should wake us up, I would hope.
Yeah, there is when I was doing the leadership intensive and that, there were two principles that I had talked about, and I call it the character competence ladder. And I said the two principles is that character without ability and skill, and that includes public persona and charisma, that leads to effectiveness. Character without ability and skill leads to ineffectiveness. Ability and skill without character leads to failure.
Yeah. And that's myth too. A leader will be successful when his or her ability and skills are fully developed.
And what we're doing is we forget that it's the character of the person, the soul of the person, that has to be strengthened and maintained and deepened, that will carry them through the long haul. So you can go to all of the conferences and you can get all of the tools that you want. But at the end of the day, if your character hasn't been developed, if you're losing your soul on the altar of ministry success, that is going to lead to failure. And we have seen that, countless times.